Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody according to the time zone you're in. Here is Clarita Maia, President of the Committee on Migration and International Trade of the Brazilian Bar Association, Brasilia section. I am today's webinar host. This webinar is promoted by the Committee on Migration and International Trade and by the Committee on Constitutional Affairs of the same Brazilian Bar Association section. Today's topic is the January 6th storming of the US legislature. It was a shocking event to both Americans and the countries which constitutional model pretty much mirrors the North American's constitution and its Republican paramount. Virtually all Latin American countries have constitutions mostly or partially inspired in North America's. The United States is probably the longest and most stable democracy in the world, well known and respected for the deference with which the constituted powers treat each other and for the awe with which their population addresses to these powers. Today's event brings together a unique cast of experts from both academia and practice. Professor Alberto do Amaral, Júnior, Associate Professor of the University of São Paulo, Brazilia's #1 academy entity, Professor Mohamed Arafa from the Universities of Alexandria, Egypt, and Cornell, United States, and Professor Victor Marcel Pinheiro, member of the Brazilian Senate Advisory Board, similar to the Congressional Research Service at the USA Parliament, and professor at IDP, Brasilia. Due to a last-minute conflict of agenda, Dr. Cristina Neves da Silva will not attend the webinar, for what she apologizes. Each speaker will offer their consideration for 15 to 20 minutes. At the end of the three presentations, we will have a Q&A section. You will be able to direct your questions through the Zoom chat to those registered at the event or through YouTube chat. Professor Mohamed Arafa will explore the January 6 events from the USA constitutional and policy perspective, the USA terrorism laws, and the international commitments regarding terrorism. In particular, Brazil, due to the alleged or fabricated proximity between some national political movements and the more conservative sectors of the American society responsible for the invasion of the Capitol Hill, watched the events with apprehension. We wondered, and I think that the international audience might have also, if what happened in the USA would not foreshadow facts in our country. To address this issue, we call Professor Alberto do Amaral, Júnior, who more specifically will explore the topic, the rule of law at risk, the Brazilian perspective. Last but not least, Dr. Victor Pinheiro will address the constitutional parallels in the North American and the Brazilian perspectives on freedom of assembly and national security. I now give the floor to Professor Mohamed Arafa. Professor Musa Wa'ir Sadiki, you have taught me. The floor is yours.
That's great, actually. Oh, thank you so much, Clarita. I appreciate it. What I'm going to say right now, botardi, probably it's botardi, yeah? It's botardi in Brasilia, which is boa noite in here. I'm speaking from Lebanon right now. So it's an interesting place, and that it's an interesting place to be in at this time, actually. So first of all, I wanted to thank you very much, Clarita, for having me on board. I know Clarita for a long time in Brazil, and she had been helping me a lot in Brazil since I came to Brazil in 2016, and we have been since that time great friends, and we always do a lot of work together. So thank you for having me on board. It's always a pleasure. I also wanted to thank, and it's a great pleasure to be with Professor Amaral and Professor Pinheiro on the panel, and I am looking forward to hear from both of you. And I do apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning. You know, now we are living in a kind of online live, so every single day we have this kind of, you know, I mean, Zooms and Teams and Telegram and all this. So it's like, so we are getting crazy with all of these things. But I'm very excited about, you know, specifically talking to the audience about what happens on January 6th, because that was a kind of shocking to all of us. And I can tell you, for somebody like me from the Middle East, you know, and to see that happen to the United States Capitol, and living there for 12 years, and to see that kind of grave attack on the temple of democracy in whatever they see themselves as the only democratic country in the world, which I do not agree with that. Of course of course there is democracy there, but I cannot agree fully with that argument. But I mean, it was a big deal for all of us. So let me start first of all, and I'm looking forward really to the talk of Professor Amaral, because he will bring the idea of rule of law, and which I will touch base on specifically from the U.S. and I can also touch on the Middle Eastern perspective and how they looked at this attack. First of all, Donald Trump, from the first day in office, he failed to commit to the peaceful transfer of power. That's the first thing that and I was like, once he's just like taking the oath, the presidential oath, and I was like saying, and that because I watched the inauguration at that time in Indiana, and I was with some of my friends, and a lot of my friends there, they said, oh, we're not going to watch that thing. And then I was like, and I said, like, so some of them, I know that this guy will never going to step down peacefully. And I said, oh, he reminded me with a lot of Arab dictators and a lot of dictators generally, but I'm focusing here specifically on Arab dictators. And this is why he have been praised by all of them, or most of them, I can say, by the president of Egypt, by the, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, by the king of Bahrain, by the king of Morocco, by the king of Jordan. All of those dictators in the region, they have been, praising him for a while, for 4 years, even before he got elected. And once he got elected, they felt happy to have Donald Trump in office. And it was a big shock for them, I can tell you, till the day or the night of the election results, which was, we had been expected to be, November 3rd, but it turned out that the results have been announced by November 7th. And that was a big shock in the region, specifically that, the states announced that Joe Biden is the president of the United States. However, I was totally expecting that Joe Biden will be the president of the United States. I can tell you because last March, before the pandemic hit, which I was like till that March, I was in the United States. And since then, I was out of there, like due to the pandemic and travel suspension and all that. So for 1 year now, and I can't wait to get back in the fall. It was interesting because I was expecting that Donald Trump will be re-elected till that March of 2020. And I talked to everybody and talked to my friends, and they said, of course, he will get in. But after the pandemic hit, and after all of the things that we have been watching, specifically the big attack on the rule of law and how he have been downplaying a pandemic and like just talking about a public health crisis in the way that he had been describing it, it's just like a virus will gonna gone by a miracle, or it will gonna gone away with or use this whatever fraudulent drugs that even the CDC was like saying, oh, you cannot do that or do this, and just playing down the vaccines, and even when he got infected, And it reminds me with how the Brazilian president is acting right now. And I'm sure that Professor Amaral will gonna talk about that, because yesterday was a very interesting interesting talk I heard from the ex-president, President Lula da Silva. He was talking to Cristina on CNN. They was watching, and he was calling President Biden for help, and they was like watching about that. And Clarita, specifically, that how I'm very interested in Brazilian politics since 4 or 5 years ago. Since I've been to the country for several times and teaching there and knowing a lot of Brazilians friend right now and all this. So I think the main important issue here when we talk about the attack on the U.S. Capitol, the main things that the Congress have been in a session for doing the business of the American people, which means that the Congress have been in session for a constitutional duty or a constitutional commitment, and specifically these commitments have to be presided by the Vice President of the United States at that time. Then Michael Pence, or Mike Pence at that time, he was the one that he had to preside. And one of the main things that we have been remembering, that since November 7, President Trump, he never ever accept that he lost the election. He never ever accept to concede and to work in order to make sure for a smooth transfer of power to the president-elect and the vice president-elect. So the idea here is to see a president in the United States, since I can tell you, at least within the modern history of America, we never see such a behavior. And I can tell you that this behavior, I can assure that I have been seeing this behavior a lot in my country, in the countries around my countries, in the Middle East. I mean, to see that, I mean, we never hear that Mubarak want to concede, or Nasser want to concede, or within Saudi Arabia, or Ben Ali in Tunisia, or, for example, Gaddafi in Libya, and these people, or these leaders, that they have been, you know, I mean, like ruling forever. Mubarak for 30 years, Ben Ali for 40 years, and all this. And, you know, they never, ever accept to concede, I mean, the transfer of power. And I think one of the main things that it makes the United States, or the democracy of the United States, as a landmark, is the commitment to the peaceful transfer of power, and how the previous administration should make it smooth within these 2 months to get into office, to make it smooth for the new administration. And this is why we see right now, for example, because of the acts of Donald Trump, because he's not believing in democracy, we can see that even probably 15 cabinet members of Biden administration just have been confirmed by the Senate, which means because he never ever accept to transfer power peacefully. And I'm not sure if you remember, I think in last September, he got a question by a reporter, and the question was directly to him. I think the reporter said, "Do you think that you will accept a peaceful transfer of power?" And his response was, actually, there will, and I'm quoting him, there will not be a transfer of power. There's going to be a continuation, you know. So he, till the last minute, on January 6th, he was calling for the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, to play down the votes of the states. And I mean, he wanted to avert, or to, you know, I mean, to prevent the vice president from certifying the votes of the states, of each state. And we have been watching some of the senators, specifically from the Republican side, that they have been dealing within that idea. Like Senator Josh Hawley, when he said, "I'm not accepting the votes of these and these and these," for example, when he was talking about Pennsylvania, and when he was talking about Georgia, for example, those votes. So the idea from a policy perspective, and even within the constitutional perspective, like just hindering the vice president of the United States, according to the Constitution, that the Congress have to be in session on January 6th every 4 years to certify and to announce the winning party. It doesn't matter Democrats or Republicans. And we have been watching this for, as I mentioned, since the modern history. I mean, we had like Carter, we had Bill Clinton, we had George Bush. I mean, it was not like to the extent to see that a sitting president, he wanted to incite for an insurrection on the Capitol Hill. And I was talking recently to an NGOs, I think in Chicago, and they have been asking me a question directly: do you think that there is a criminal accountability for former President Trump on that? And I totally agree. And I absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like, this is a complicity. That's a complicit act. I mean, he said, if you do not fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, which means that you have to do this He had been inciting for a violence activity. We never had that before. I mean, I never see such a thing. I attended like 2 elections there. Of course, I saw like people are like talking. They could be like a little bit aggressive, but not to the extent to see people like 6 police officers have been died and probably over 200 or 300 people got wounded with that insurrection. So in addition, that the vice president was in a harm situation at this time, and we have been watching. I mean, after the insurrection, we have been watching how the vice president have been acting. Towards the behavior of Donald Trump, and I assume by all of you that you watched the letter from Mike Pence to Donald Trump, mentioning explicitly that he will not have any responsibility, or he do not have any authority as a vice president of the United States to turn out the votes. So attacking democracy in that way, I can see that was a big deal within the modern constitutional theory. I mean, that was a lot of constitutional law professors, and you can see how they have been talking about this act at the moment. And to watch that sitting, specifically from a sitting president, he's saying this or he's doing this. And when we talked about impeachment, it was a kind of interesting at that time, because we have been for sure know about the results of impeachment. I mean, the second impeachment, when the House of Representatives that they have voted to impeach Trump. I mean, after the insurrection, I think on January 13th, and then he got to be on the Senate for the trial for the Senate floor. But I mean, that was kind of interesting to see, because we already know. But the interesting thing, and I mean, which was like kind of surprising a lot of us, that 7 Republicans that they have been voted to impeach Donald Trump based on the facts that he incited an insurrection, which means it's a criminal activity according to the domestic laws of the United States and according to the international commitments that the United States is a part of. The international agreements on terrorism have been detailing these acts as a violence act. I mean, act of terrorism is a violent activity based on political ideology. And Trump have been repeating a big lie even before the people got to the ballots. I can imagine that most of the whole year of 2020, Trump have been saying the only way that we will lose the election, that this election will going to be rigged, or we're going to be stolen from us, or we're going to be like, and that was a big, I think, deal specifically. And I'm sure that Victor will develop on that when we're talking about the national security. I mean, that was a big harm to the national security interest of the country, like to just spread a lie or to spread that we will never, ever lose this election unless it's just rigged by the Democrats or whatever he have been calling for. One of the main things, remember, for this attack on the constitutional democracy, because it was also a kind of a sequence to see how this already led to that insurrection, that his call with as Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, when he was calling him, and he's saying to him, according to a recent report by the Washington Post, and he was like just saying, and I'm quoting him here, and he said like, all I want to do that to find votes, which mean that the Secretary of State also have to commit a crime in order to make the idea or I mean just to turn out the results of the election. I think I to be honest, I never saw such a thing. But one of the interesting things that I want to tell you here before I leave the floor to the other speakers, the impact on that to the Middle Eastern leaders and the Middle Eastern policymakers. One of the main things that I can tell you, that leaders in Egypt or Tunisia or in countries around, that they saw the attack in a big shock, but they have been saying like, yeah, sure, but they have been saying like, okay, we are thinking that President Trump should be the next president and President Biden stole the election. Can you imagine that? Because they have been just hoping for the dictator to be staying in office, to have the dictator stay in office. Like recently, President Biden's Secretary of State, Blinken, he mentioned to the Egyptian Secretary of State that the United States will have a different approach toward Egypt. Of course, we will be working with the Egyptian allies, but in terms of human rights records, we have to make sure that the human rights record is in a good shape. The attack on our Capitol Hill was an exceptional act. It was not like, as you guys thought, or because the business of the people, I can say, have been continued after the attack. Of course, the Capitol have been experienced a big attack on the democracy, or on democracy, but I can say that for Middle Eastern leaders, that was a big deal to see Donald Trump is out of office. And till the last minute, I can tell you, till January 6th, Middle Eastern leaders, they have been hoping that Biden would not get into office, and they thought that they may they thought that was maybe like somebody going to turn out the election result or such a thing. But I can assure you that to conclude, that I can say that an attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th is an insurrection, an incitement of an insurrection happened by, at that time, a sitting president of the United States. However, he was just have like 2 weeks left in office, but that means that even till your last day, you already sworn in an oath to uphold, to protect, and to defend and preserve the Constitution. And he violated his oath of presidency. And I think right now, however the impeachment fail, Donald Trump have to be accountable criminally, or from the criminal perspective, and have to show up in a criminal court. With that, I'm turning the floor to the other speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mohamed Arafa, for your proverbial brave approach on the subject. Once again, an honor to have you here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I hope you have time to stay with us until the Q&A session.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. We reach now a point of natural transition in which we will explore the lessons and parallels of the U.S. legislature assault in relation to the Brazilian law and actual political scenario. I now give the floor to Professor Alberto Amaral, Júnior, who will explore the topic, the rule of law at risk, the Brazilian perspective. Please, Professor Alberto, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, the Lebanese friends who are eventually attending this event. Many thanks, Clarita, in the name of whom I thank the Brazilian Bar Association for organizing this timely panel. To begin with, I will pose a vaccine question. Can Brazil repeat what happened in the United States when in January there was an invasion in the Capitol? And my answer that I will try to develop is yes. And I will explain the reasons my position is in favor of this thesis now. First, there is a great similarity between Bolsonaro and Trump. Bolsonaro tried to import to Brazil Trump's gesture as regards democracy, tried to adopt in Brazil the same style that Trump used in the United States to govern that country. And I will explore a bit more this question later. But what is the continuity between the American and the Brazilian experience in this context? There is no rupture, but a continuity between the American and the Brazilian experience in the last 4 years. And mainly in the last 2 years. The first point to be highlighted is the rise of far right in the world. Far right movements, the importance of autocracies to detriment of democracy is a pervasive phenomenon now. And Trump is an offspring of this generalized reality. And the far right has some common features, and those features you detail about democracy, but in general, the far right is against modernity, is against enlightenment, is against the importance of science and the relevance that science has gained in the two last centuries. And as such, the far right adopts a traditional vision of social relations, in particular, family and traditions. And the far right proclaims the return to patriarchalism. As regards democracy, I shall put emphasis on some specific questions. The populist and far-right rulers across the world share more or less the same characteristics. And Bolsonaro, as such, conveys and expresses those features. The first feature, the far-right rulers and the populist rulers believe in homogeneity, Bolsonaro believes that society is eminently homogeneous. In other words, there are no divisions in society, but only a whole. There is no division between different social groups, social segments, and classes. But the ruler expresses the people's will. There is a conflation between the people and the ruler, so as to express the people's will. Second, populist and far-right leaders around the world are anti-institutionalists. They are against institutions. And being against institutions, they are against the division of powers, one of the most important facts marking our democracies since the 18th century. And the division of power, the fair elections, the judicial competence to arbitrate, to judge conflicts in society, this classical political engineering envisioned in the 18th century is called into question by far-right rulers around the world and far-right politicians around the world. Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, Trump in the United States and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and even the Poland government does the same. And as such, institutions don't gain the prestige they have to maintain the balance of power, to maintain the balance among different functions that government has in a democracy, that state has in a modern democracy. And the third feature of this process is clientelism. Clientelism is represented by the fact that populists try to put in key offices, in key state posts, people who are allied to their vision. The large-scale use of militaries in Brazil is a sharp example of this. Clientelism is a form to garner support from a specific sector that can use its power to keep the ruler in its situation of dominance, of political dominance. The fourth feature is that populism and autocracy is against pluralism. Pluralism is one of the most typical characteristics of modern democracies. We can not have a true modern society with different political parties, social segments, non-governmental organizations, each of which conveying their views about different topics that are discussed in the public sphere. Pluralism is the quintessential of modern democracy and is able to revitalize constantly democracy and to put it in place and to guarantee that some features can be changed with the passage of time. And one of the main points that pluralism stresses is the fact that a minority today can, through elections, free and fair elections, to be the majority later or afterwards. And from this perspective, the possibility that the power can change from one hand to another is decisive for a democracy to be one of the underpinnings of political life. But if those features are shared by far-right politicians and rules across the world, there are other phenomena that magnify the existence of populism and autocracy. And I particularly refer to the use of internet and the consensus manipulation. And I turn back to the end of 1990s when an Italian engineer, Gian Roberto Caleggio, invented a new way of manipulating the political will through the use of internet. And at that time, he used the internet. And the manner he used to manipulate the political will is fundamentally grounded in several techniques. First, the use of robots. Second, the massive repetition of some message with the same content. And the intensive use of those messages gives the impression that there are a number of people supporting this view in the political scene. And from a psychological prism, we can notice that there is an effect of this manipulated consensus on the rest of the people who partake social media. Social media is then a new and indispensable mechanism for the populists, for the far right, to be on the rise in our time. And the consensus manipulation uses fake news, uses anonymity as a way of spreading news which don't have any correspondence to reality. And those messages spills over some facts, built facts, forged facts, in which reality is fully distorted. And as a result of distortion of reality, it's possible to pervert and to subvert the scientific knowledge accumulated throughout the passage of time. And those mechanisms are used by populist leaders and has been used in Brazil by Bolsonaro's government. And since the first day that Bolsonaro took office in Brazil, he adopted a systematic policy to undertake a fight against the free press, against the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, and against the existence of free powers. And Bolsonaro has recently accused the Brazilian electoral system of being inclined to afford manipulations and risks in a new election here. He doubted the credibility of the Brazilian ballot system. And as a result of the Trump's accusations to the American system against the electoral American system, Bolsonaro applied the same method to accuse the ballot box system in Brazil of being able to distort the popular will. And Bolsonaro has systematically taken steps to pass from threats to actions. Initially, Bolsonaro and his supporters threatened some newspapers, some television channels. Bolsonaro accused the Supreme Court of overtaking its power. Bolsonaro criticized bitterly the Brazilian Congress for not approving some measures, and Bolsonaro acted irresponsibly in the case of coronavirus pandemic in Brazil. But more dangerous, Bolsonaro has recently adopted measures to cause a climate of fear, intimidating and incarcerating people and accusing people of criticizing the government, of adopting the free possibility of using the popular will as a mechanism to control the government. And this is very, very problematic. He menaces the adoption of the state of siege in Brazil. The state of siege can only be adopted through authorization of the Brazilian Congress, and there are specific situations when it can be resorted by the government, and he deliberately confuses the state of siege with measures to restrict the people's circulation by virtue of the overspread pandemic in Brazil. And we live in Brazil in a situation of risk. We have a constitution. Our constitution dates back to 1988. It marked the re-democratization of the country and the passage from the military dictatorship to democracy. And Brazil has ever had a so great menace to democracy in those years as we have now. This is a dangerous moment for the Brazilian democracy, and the phenomenon that the United States lived in January, last January, with the invasion of the Capitol, can repeat here in the case of a Bolsonaro's defeat in the next Brazilian election. And in the period until the next election, we are witnessing a series, constant and daily threats to rule of law. And in this case, there is a similarity, there is an analogy between the North American situation, what Donald Trump did in the United States, and the Brazilian situation. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt. We were reaching our final minutes. Thank you, Professor Alberto, for the enlightening approach. I now give the floor to Professor Victor Pinheiro, who will approach the parallels between US and Brazilian legal frameworks on freedom of assembly and national security. Please, Professor Victor Pinheiro, the floor is yours.
So, thank you, Clarita. Thank you for the Committee on International Affairs of the Bar Association, Brazilian Bar Association, Brasilia section, for inviting me to this presentation. I am very much honored to share the floor with Professor Mohamed Arafa and Professor Alberto Amaral, Júnior. I cannot help but to register here that Professor Amaral was my law professor when I was a grad student at the University of São Paulo in 2007. And seeing you, Professor, at our private library gives me a hint where, a partial explanation for your vast legal and political culture that sets examples for me back from then and until present days. So I'd like to make brief remarks here about 2 points that I've prepared. And it was a happy coincidence to hear Professor Mohamed and Alberto before me in the way that I'll try to make a link, a bridge between the 2 presentations that we had. On the one hand, I'm going to talk about what I see as some effects about the political discontent with liberal democracies, the US capital invasion. And on the other hand, I'll try to bring some reflections on the causes for this disaffection. So when you think about the recent events in the US Capitol Hill, I think Professor Mohamed was precise in his presentation in the sense that it sets a bad example for the whole world. Of course, I believe American democracy is one of the bastions of democracy, of freedom, of the rule of law around the world. And when you see events like that, it immediately resonates in other countries. As Professor Alberto has told us, I believe that 1 or 2 days after these events in the US Congress, our President Bolsonaro, said that something alike could happen in 2022 when we have presidential elections here, if elections in Brazil were not fair, were not clean. So I believe this is an important event for every major democracy in the world, because I believe it shows a broader tendency that many scholars have been talking about the rise of the so-called illiberal democracies. When we think about this concept of illiberal democracies, these researchers are talking about something like political regimes that look like democracies. They have separation of powers. They have fundamental rights basically in written declarations. They have regular elections. But when you see how these institutions, these powers are used in practice, you can see that sometimes they are pushed to a limit, a fringe that you can even see if you have a democracy or a different model. And I believe that a concept here that's very useful to understand this situation was coined by Mark Tushnet when he described what is constitutional hardball is. When you're playing constitutional hardball, basically you are over pushing the boundaries of our powers to get to receive political benefits in a way that breaks practical norms, social accepted norms of restraint and forbearance when using this institutionalized power. I believe that here in Brazil, we have been seeing in the couple of months a debate in our Supreme Court, in our political scenario about our national security law. There was a congressman who was arrested by an order of a Supreme Court under this national security law. There were some police initiatives to arrest other persons who were protesting or demonstrating against government under the national security law. And when we see the origins of this statute in Brazil, it's interesting to note that it goes back to the 30s and later 40s, when there is a so-called national security doctrine and it's interesting to see that it was kind of inspired or imported from the National War College from the United States, in the sense that the armed forces, the military, had a role to play, not only in the external defense of a country, but also in an internal role to defend democracy from internal enemies. The so-called national security doctrine was used to create different national security laws. And the one that we have today was made in 1983, when we were under a military dictatorship in Brazil, and it is still in force today. And it's interesting to note that this law from 1983, it was used before our constitution, before our constitution of 1988, basically to prosecute, to arrest, and to condemn to trial people who were making critics, basically journalists and artists, public critics to the government. After the constitution, we've seen many cases of application of this law, especially in our Supreme Court, but related to different matters, related to bring into our national territory guns or military warfare that is restricted, which use is restricted to the military. But from a couple of years ago, we've seen, I believe in 2016 on, we've seen the use of this law again against public manifestations of opinions, of critics to the government. And there's been some actions in our Supreme Court to challenge the constitutionality of this law. But one point that I'd like to make here is that I believe that criminal law, harsh punishment, is not the solution for a political problem. If you think about what has been happening in the US, in Brazil, and in other countries, like Professor Alberto told us, in Hungary, or Poland, in other countries that are facing this far-right political power's rise challenge, we see that we have a political problem. And this is the second point that I'd like to make in my brief presentation. We have a political problem in the sense that there is a pervasive disaffection with liberal representative democracies. And I'd like to stress here, especially the presidential systems. This, of course, I'm not saying this, the capital invasion on other manifestations or actions are legal, compatible with law, but the instruments that are being deployed to face these conducts, maybe we should think about more than just criminal law. Criminal law is a rigid branch of law. It brings people into fixed categories. You're a criminal or you're not. And you have much broader causes for this political disaffection. And my hypothesis here that I'd like to share with you and hear your opinion about is that representative democracies, they have few institutionalized mechanisms to relink, to reinvigorate the relationship between representatives and their constituents. I'd like to take a lead here that was brought to us by Professor Alberto about this populist wave that we're seeing all around the world. When we think about what representative democracy means, I like to remember the writings of Professor Nadia Urbinati from Columbia University. And she says that representation in the political sense goes far beyond the moment of the elections. When we think about representation, we are not talking about just giving someone power, delegating power to someone to conduct business in our name. Representation is a permanent link. It's a permanent relationship between representatives and their constituents, in which there must be some kind of responsiveness. And it's fundamental, it's crucial that this responsiveness to the interests of the constituents is institutionalized in the constitutions and the laws, that we have mechanisms to constantly reinvigorate this relationship. In this sense, I believe it's also important to recall the so-called myth of the will of the people. There's a very interesting, nice book written by Professor Albert Wheeler from University College London about it. And the idea that one person, as Professor Alberto told us, one person could, in some sense, represent an entire population, millions of people who have different views, who have different opinions, beliefs, creeds, religions. It's absolutely unrealistic. To live in a democracy is to recognize the differences that we have in society. And when you recognize that, it becomes more important to reinforce this link between representatives and their constituents. We've seen, for example, Bruce Ackerman has, I can say, a classic article about this, discussions about what is the ideal model for political regimes to adopt. Besides presidential systems, Ackerman defends a kind of mixed system with parliamentary characteristics, but not the one from Westminster, not the ones from United Kingdom, but something like something closer to Germany or Portugal, in which you have at the same time a head of government, generally a prime minister, and you have a president or a head of state, monarch, a head of state that it's responsible for diplomatic relations and some, I'd say, exceptional constitutional powers to in crisis, in situations where there's no political agreement to form a new government. The president or the monarch could dissolve parliament, call new elections, and try to renew this link between representatives and constituents. I'd like to close these small remarks by calling to attention an article, a very nice article that was published this year by Professor Tom Ginsburg and his colleagues about the uses of impeachment in different countries. They've researched how this instrument was recently used in Brazil, in South Korea, in Paraguay, and in South Africa. And their conclusion is that the impeachment institution, at least in recent times, it's been used not as a procedure to identify and punish criminal conducts, but to remove from office people who do not have the majority support, political support, to stay there. And I believe this points to an important consideration in the sense that the political system must have different institutionalized mechanisms to face challenges, to face, I could say, these contestations that are being made by the president, by congressmen, by anyone who challenges its legitimacy. I believe we have seen this in the case of the United States with President Trump, and maybe here in Brazil, President Bolsonaro too. When you have just one instrument, presidential impeachment, in an all or nothing way, you become restricted in what you can do to face these challenges. I believe it's important to the political system in an institutionalized way to say it is not okay to question the fairness of elections. It is not okay to question the importance of the judicial system and the fundamental rights, but not necessarily conducting to an impeachment trial. I believe that there are other possible grounds, and we can be creative here in terms of institutional design, to develop mechanisms of warning, maybe of suspending some kind of functions temporarily, and other mechanisms to try to take some steps earlier than an impeachment process to make these signals. It's not okay to question democracy itself, and maybe that could conduct to an impeachment process. But when you have this institutionalized opportunity to do that, I believe that maybe the representative democracy can, at some point, protect itself from these declarations, from these conducts, without resorting to a last, let's say, to a last weapon, like the criminal law with national security law, or to impeachment process that we've been seeing that its nature is changing over time. It's becoming more and more far from its origins, from its English origins, in which it was considered a criminal offense that could give rise to impeachment process. And we've seen nowadays that these impeachments are becoming more and more political ones. So with these short remarks, I'd like to thank you, Clarita, and thank the panelists also for hearing me. And I'm eager to hear what our impressions on the issue are.
Thank you very much, Professor Victor Pinheiro. What a momentous reflection on in the end of the day, the assault on liberal democracy and the need of legislative improvements for avoiding the impeachment as a common resort in our democracies. We now go to the Q&A session. I summarize the questions on the following. Amanda Victoria Souza asks, good evening. How do you evaluate the response of other democratic institutions, Congress and Judiciary, to the actions of then President Donald Trump? And once he was acquitted in the impeachment process, was the response of democracy sufficient? I think that it's addressed to the three of the speakers, please. Professor Mohamed, would you have a try? You are muted, Professor.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think the problem with the impeachment of Donald Trump, and I really here wanted to stress on Victor's presentation at the end when he was talking about how we should not only focus on impeachment as a last, as you mentioned too, Clarita, as just a last resort, because impeachment is a political tool. It's just not a legal thing. So, and as Victor mentioned, we impeach because we wanted to remove from office, or even after that to disqualify some from holding future office under U.S. laws. So the idea of having the president acquittal, I mean, he got acquitted politically, not legally, and politically because of the votes. You know, we need the 2/3 of the Senate to vote for being guilty, and then he just got acquittal because Republicans, to some extent, they are not like thinking or believing that Donald Trump was committed a crime. At least if we question the idea of if he really committed a criminal offense or not, at least we have to watch out on his different acts and different behaviors throughout the 4 years in office. And Professor Alberto here mentioned ideas on that, specifically when he talked about the attack on freedom of press and the freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly. And also that's the same thing that Donald Trump have been practicing the whole 4 years. Like the news is the enemy of the people, or the media is the enemy of the people. Fake news, you know, and you know, all of the Middle Eastern leaders have been right now happy to say these words. They love this word of fake news right now, you know. When he had been talking about minorities' rights, you know, like women rights or religious people or so, you know, so it was like look at what he had been also doing for immigrants, you know. So it had been a big attack, not only just because the act of insurrection. I mean, the act of insurrection, he had a bad luck because it happened at the last minute of his presidency. But the problem is that he had been like fueling a toxic environment for the last 4 years within the U.S. policies. And one of the main things that I remember that I talked about before under Don, I think in 2017 or 2018, I was talking about the moral responsibility of the United States under this guy. because mostly United States always wanted to show the world that they have more responsibility towards democracy for the whole world. But under Trump, I didn't see any kind of this moral perspective under his presidency. And I think one of the main things that Biden mentioned, or even any regular, even George Bush mentioned that we need to have the decency back to the White House, so that was hard to see, like, just somebody like talking like that, attack on judiciary, like attacking federal judges, like attacking the Supreme Court justices, even his appointees. He was just saying he thought that they would rule for him, specifically the last one, even Amy Coney Barrett. He was like, people have been like, I remember that discussion back in October, and everybody was very afraid of Amy Coney Barrett. And I said, no, I'm sure that Amy Coney Barrett will never ever rule, because she's just appointed by Donald Trump. She will just rule based on her philosophy, or her judicial philosophy, and the law in front of her, and the Constitution, So it was, I think the acquittal for Donald Trump was just politically, not legally. And this is why the attack or the assault on democracy is still on the brink.
Professor Alberto, would you have any consideration about this question?
It answered very well. I will add only a few elements. The first element is that the United States has probably the broadest free speech system across the world. And the United States, unlike European countries, did not live in the past dictatorships or interruptions of the democratic system, and did not suffer effects flowing from the radio used by the fascism and Nazism that led to Second World War. And according to the American case law, the criminalization of Trump can be problematic. The First Amendment is too broad to make possible the Trump's responsibility before the American courts, due to the fact that the American case law requires a close connection between the incitation to violence and the damage.
That's true.
And the connection between the incitation of the violence as a trigger, as a cause of the damage, without an interruption, is the root cause of a violation of the American First Amendment. This is controversial among the American jurists, but this is a hurdle that can be won before the American courts.
Thank you, Professor Alberto. Professor Victor Pinheiro, do you have any thoughts on this?
Just small remark. I believe the American institutions, they reacted as they could to the conduct of President Trump, but that only stresses the point that Professor Alberto, Professor Mohamed, and I tried to make, that criminal law, impeachment, they have their limitations. I really believe that we should be more creative with different kind of institutionalized mechanisms, not just political ones, a congressman getting to make a public declaration, but institutionalized ones. Maybe a warning, maybe, I don't know, a temporary suspension, maybe a demand for more information and justification with some penalties attached if they are not responded to. but different mechanisms that could, in some sense, could enhance this civility and transparency duties of the sitting president of a democracy.
I echo Victor here, and I really agree with him that the institutional solution would be much more effective than political or just legal one. Yeah, that's true.
There are other questions here that I summarize on the following. 7 days after the US legislature storming, the Congressional Research Service circulated a paper in which it defended the thesis that the events configured acts of domestic terrorism. According to a quote and a large quote, the federal definition of domestic terrorism describes domestic terrorists as Americans who commit ideologically driven crimes in the US, but lack foreign direction or influence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, generally relies on two sources to define domestic terrorism. First, the Code of Federal Regulations characterizes terrorism as including the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. Second, 18 U.S.C. paragraph 23.315 more narrowly defines domestic terrorism. This definition comes from section 802 of the USA Patriot Act, PL 10756. According to, domestic terrorism occurs primarily within the U.S. territorial jurisdiction and involves acts dangerous to human life that are a violation to criminal laws of the United States or any state that appears to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. According to the Congressional Research Service, they conclude that the participants' actions seem to fit both definitions. The problems addressed in charging the responsibles being two, according to the Congressional Research Service, and three, in my personal opinion. First, the FBI does not officially designate domestic terrorist organizations. And we all know the US works with the praxis of lists, which is also adopted by the UN Security Council in order to investigate and charge organizations, being QAnon, being Antifas, whatever. Two, domestic terrorism is not a chargeable offense on its own. There is no federal criminal statute that establishes criminal penalties solely for domestic terrorism, although it may be an element of other federal crimes or provide an enhanced sentence. And three, it's my consideration, apart from the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, there is no jurisprudence in which speeches and mere incitation are considered to be crimes per se. I think that it is time for the international juridical community to understand that words coming from leaders are more than words. The questions are, one, and addressed to all the three speakers. Do you have seen the opinion that the domestic terrorism rules must be polished, reverberated in politics and academia in the United States or in other scenarios? Two, the so-called conservatism which promoted the assault on the US legislature, as Professor Amaral said, is a cultural and sociological phenomenon more linked to traditionalism than to political conservatism per se. Despite its feeble intellectual framework, it translates a good part of the population's mood and way of thinking. Due to its political and seen violence and intolerance inappropriate to the liberal political environment, would it not be of utmost importance a closer look, academic and legal, to those movements? And finally, three, The American Bar Association has promoted events in which the authoritarian turn of international law is exposed. International treaties on terrorism, a new generation of treaties, plurilateral, are being crafted for political purpose of silencing opposition. What would be the protection of the liberal world against such attempts? Please, I will give the floor to Professor Mohamed.
I mean, actually, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, that's an interesting blog. Actually, it's not a question, but I think I think I will start from the last regarding when we're talking about some event that had been held by U.S. institutions to silence some. I mean, that could happen. I mean, of course, I mean, that could happen by conservative approaches. And I think Professor Alberto have been highlighting a lot on that when he was talking about far right. And we actually can see a perspective right now towards this kind of conservative, I mean, authoritarianism generally in the whole world. And one of the examples also that mentioned by Professor Alberto is like Hungary. I mean, you know, and we recently saw in the Netherlands and, you know, and of course the whole Middle East and in Brazil and, you know, in Venezuela, I mean, you know, and lastly was within the United States by Donald Trump. So I can tell you one of the main things that you cannot silence opposition in a way as we can see in other countries. Like, for example, how Saudi Arabia, for example, they silenced Gamal Khashoggi, right? I mean, they silenced, they killed the guy. I mean, they killed a reporter because he had been a big critic of the government and the policies of the government and the crown prince and all that. And now when it comes to the responsibility, I mean, the United States under Donald Trump says, or Trump doesn't like think that the crown prince have committed anything or that he does have any relation with that. Then under Biden administration recently, of course, that there have been 75 people that they have been associated with that murder or with that act of killing, except even the crown prince. And 2 days ago, they asked Biden about why you have been just like excluded the crown prince from the punishment, like the 75 people that they got punished, like by, you know, banning them to get visas or to get into the United States territory or soil or something like that. But the idea was like, and Biden responded, he said, because we have political interest, not only in Saudi Arabia, but also in the region, you know, of course, the oil, of course, the counterterrorism program. And of course, you know, they wanted to make sure to avoid any kind of rise in radicalism within the region, specifically when we're talking about the Wahhabism approach and stuff like that. You know, when it comes to national security, as Victor mentioned, specifically when it comes to economic and business interests. So I think silencing that could happen. I mean, that could happen, but not in the way that we can see in the Middle East. I mean, like by canceling a talk, for example, that could happen in the United States. However, it's very rare to see that happen. And when it comes, as you guys mentioned, academically or politically, I don't think that academically you can silence a professor or an academician or a scholar. However, sometimes you can use his or her thoughts against afterwards. Like, for example, recently, I mean, as Amy Coney Barrett, before she had been just appointed as a justice of the Supreme Court, she had been a law professor at Notre Dame. And every single senator on her hearing, confirmation hearing, have been just went through her articles, her law review articles, her talks, and they have been like walking through specific lines or specific paragraphs that she thought from her perspective as a scholar. At that time, she was not a judge, as a scholar. And she said, oh, that's my opinion as an academician. And they have been asking her about that. And she said one good thing, and I'm quoting her here. She said, being a professor or an academician or a scholar is totally different than being a judge. because being a scholar, you can write whatever you want, of course, in big democracies, including Latin America and stuff, not in the Middle East. But she said, but being a judge, I will be here, abide by the law and abide by the facts. So it's totally different. So here we can say that the academia versus being a practitioner, you know. So I think silencing, it could be happen, and it could happen, but not in the way, like as we can see even in big democracies, like in UK, for example, they are the democracy there, but I mean they believe in racism, and we have been watching recently about the interview that happened by Harry and Meghan, and specifically about the skin of their kid. If there was a concern in the palace about the skin of their kid, you know. So I think on that thing, I mean, on the idea of silencing, that could happen. Of course, it grows too much in the Middle East. I can say probably in Latin America, of course, in Europe. And I agree with Professor Alberto here when he talked about the broad definition of the free speech in the United States. That's absolutely right. I agree with him on that. And this is why you will see that different legal scholars are kind of diversified when they said, for example, the speech of Trump on January 6th was like protected by the First Amendment, or it could be considered a part of a criminal activity, you know? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mohamed. Professor Alberto, any thoughts on those questions? You're muted. You're muted, Professor. Professor Alberto, you're muted. I think that...
Not yet.
Not yet, yeah.
Only a few comments, briefly. First, let me see this question from another lens. The reaction of American institutions in the present and in the future, before the Trumpism and before the Trump reaction against democratic institutions. It is, of course, not sure how Trumpism will behave in the face of American institutions. And one of those institutions is mainly the American Capitol Hill. And 2 weeks ago, everyone knew that there was a menace to invade the Capitol Hill. And this obliged to close the Congress for 1 day. And we don't know how Trumpism will take recourse to a variety of violent instruments to encroach the civil and political liberties in the United States. Trump had a large number, an extraordinary number of ballots in the last election, and a large portion of the American population believes in it, and believes in it like they believe in words. And it is a risk, and this fraction of the American population feels that American elections were fraudulent, and that Trump indeed won the election. And this will be a challenge for American institutions in the future. for different prisms, will consider this challenge. For example, how American institutions will react before the use of violence against the heart of American political system, against the judicial political system, against universities, against the executive branch, and against the Capitol Hill. This is a situation that cannot be now fully defined or fully answered. We depend on the events that will take place in the near future and in the medium term to respond how strong American institutions are to eliminate risks to their prevalence.
Thank you very much, Professor Alberto. Professor Vitor Pinheiro, please, your considerations on the topic.
Well, I'm not a criminal law, even less an American specialist on American criminal law, so I cannot say if we should depict these acts as terrorism or not. But one thing I suspect, when we use these strong criminal laws like terrorism, national security laws, and so on, there is a great risk that these laws will at some point backfire at society. And they will backfire especially on the weakest, on minorities, on social movements. And so I believe, so far as I've seen from the news, there are many conducts that were perpetrated there in the US Capitol Hill were criminal ones. I'm not sure if terrorism or other penalty offenses, but I'm 99% sure that criminal law, terrorism law, national security law won't solve these problems. From my point of view, the problems we've seen in the US Capitol Hill were not only criminal offenses, maybe they were, but there were political causes and implications for that. When we treat this as ordinary or even extraordinary criminal law, the problem will remain the same. It will, this affection will find other ways to express itself. So I really believe that we should think about how to attack, how to face the causes of it. This broken link in our democracies between representatives and constituents.
Very well taken point. Thank you, Professor Vitor. We now reach the end of our webinar. Thank you for the speakers for having been with us, dedicating time and reflection on such momentous and important topics. And thank you for the audience. Keep in touch with the Brazilian Bar Association agenda of events. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody according to the time zone you're in.